The story of the PlayStation is not just a story about a video game console. It is a tale of corporate betrayal, a stunning revenge plot, and a radical gamble that would reshape global entertainment. It begins not with Sony, but with a partnership gone wrong with the then-dominant force in gaming, Nintendo. In the late 1980s, Nintendo was riding high on the success of its Nintendo Entertainment System. CDs were the exciting new technology, promising far more storage and richer sounds than the cartridges Nintendo used. Sony, a titan in electronics and music, saw an opportunity. The two giants decided to collaborate. Sony would develop a CD-ROM attachment for the Super Nintendo called the PlayStation. It would play both SNES cartridges and new games on Sony's proprietary CD format. The deal was struck, and the world was announced. But behind the scenes, Nintendo was growing nervous. The agreement gave Sony control over the licensing for all the CD-based games, a massive piece of revenue that Nintendo was not willing to surrender. They saw Sony not as a partner but as a future competitor that was getting too powerful. So, in one of the most shocking betrayals in business history, Nintendo abruptly broke the partnership at the 1991 Consumer Electronics Show. They announced a new deal with Sony's rival, Philips, leaving the Japanese electronics giant humiliated on the world stage. The man tasked with leading the project for Sony, Ken Kutaragi, was crushed. He had invested years of his life and passion into the project, earning him the nickname, the father of the PlayStation within Sony. But now it was all for nothing. The betrayal, however, had planted a seed. The anger and humiliation would soon transform into a burning desire for revenge. Sony, a company known for its polite and conservative corporate culture, was about to get ruthless. Instead of shelving the project, Sony's leadership, fueled by Kutaragi's unwavering belief, made a monumental decision. They would enter the video game console market alone. They would take the technology developed for the Nintendo project and build their own machine, a machine designed not just to compete, but to dominate. This was an insane risk. The video game market was a brutal playground. Atari had crashed, Sega and Nintendo were locked in a bloody console war, and the industry was seen as a niche for kids and teenagers. For a prestigious company like Sony to jump into this fray was considered corporate suicide by many. But Kutaragi had a vision. He saw that gaming was the future of home entertainment, a fusion of technology and art. He convinced the Sony board that they weren't just making a toy. They were creating a sophisticated computer for the living room. The project was greenlit, and the mission was clear: defeat Nintendo. The team, operating with a startup mentality inside the giant corporation, worked tirelessly. They focused on raw power, designing a system that was significantly more powerful than the upcoming Sega Saturn and Nintendo 64. They made another critical decision, one born from the pain of the Nintendo betrayal. They would make the PlayStation incredibly easy for game developers to work with. While Sega and Nintendo used complex proprietary architecture, Sony provided clear and accessible development tools. This was a masterstroke. It won the hearts and minds of the very people who would decide the console's fate, the game developers. The final genius piece of the strategy was the business model. Nintendo made a huge profit on every cartridge sold, but the cartridges were expensive to produce. Sony decided to use the much cheaper CD format. This allowed them to sell the PlayStation hardware at a loss, a radical concept at the time. They would recoup the money and make their profit by taking a small licensing fee from every game sold for their system. This made the PlayStation an attractive, affordable machine for consumers and a highly profitable platform for third-party game developers who flocked to it in droves. The stage was set for a launch that would change everything. On December 3, 1994, the Sony PlayStation launched in Japan. The marketing was not targeting children. It was cool, edgy, and aimed at teenagers and young adults. The iconic logo, the futuristic gray design, and the promise of a new generation of gaming created an electric buzz. The launch titles, like the futuristic racing game Ridge Racer, showcased the system's power and the immersive potential of CD-quality sound. But it was a game released a year later that would become the system's ultimate killer app, a game that would define a generation and prove that video games could be a serious cinematic art form. That game was Final Fantasy VII. Square, the developer, famously abandoned Nintendo's cartridges, citing the storage limitations, and brought their flagship franchise to the PlayStation. It was a defection that sent shockwaves through the industry and cemented the PlayStation as the new home for epic, narrative-driven experiences. The revenge against Nintendo was almost complete. The PlayStation was not just a success. It was a cultural phenomenon. It had dethroned the king and established a new dynasty. But the war was far from over. The victory of the first PlayStation was just the beginning of a much larger battle to come. The success of the original PlayStation was beyond anyone's wildest dreams. It had not just entered the market, it had completely rewritten the rules, dethroning Nintendo and effectively forcing Sega out of the hardware business. But in the world of technology, yesterday's revolution is today's old news. The pressure was now on Sony to do the impossible again, to create a successor that could live up to the legendary status of the first PlayStation. The company, however, was operating from a position of immense strength, and they were about to unleash a weapon so powerful it would become the best-selling console of all time. The development of the PlayStation 2 was shrouded in secrecy and ambition. Ken Kutaragi, now a hero within Sony, had a grand, almost Kwang-Wang vision. He didn't want to create just a gaming console. He wanted to create a supercomputer for the living room. The heart of the PS2 was the Emotion Engine, a processor so complex and difficult to program for that many developers initially struggled with it. But its potential was staggering. It promised graphics that could deliver truly cinematic experiences. Sony also made a critical strategic decision. The PS2 would be the cheapest and most effective DVD player on the market. At a time when standalone DVD players were still expensive, this was a masterstroke. It positioned the PS2 not as a mere toy, but as the central entertainment hub for the modern household. Parents would buy it for the family, justifying the cost because it was a DVD player, while the kids and teenagers would use it for its groundbreaking games. When the PlayStation 2 launched in the year 2000, it caused a frenzy the world had never seen before. Lines stretched around city blocks. Supplies were so limited that they were selling for thousands of dollars on the secondary market. The hype was not just about games. It was about owning a piece of the future. The strategy worked flawlessly. The PS2 became a cultural and commercial juggernaut. It was the console that gave us iconic franchises like Grand Theft Auto, Vice City, God of War, and Metal Gear Solid 2. Its library was vast, diverse, and critically acclaimed. For nearly 6 years, it faced almost no meaningful competition. Microsoft entered the fray with the Xbox and Nintendo released the GameCube, but neither could dethrone the PS2. It was a perfect storm of superior technology, brilliant marketing, and perfect timing. It sold over 155 million units, a record that still stands today. Sony was at the absolute peak of its power, the undisputed king of the gaming world. They seemed untouchable. But this immense success bred a dangerous level of arrogance, an arrogance that would lead them to the brink of disaster in the next generation. The announcement of the PlayStation 3 was a moment of shock and awe, but for all the wrong reasons. Kutaragi's vision had grown even more ambitious. The PS3 was to be a supercomputer, a hub for the future of home entertainment, featuring a revolutionary but notoriously difficult-to-program cell processor and a brand-new high-definition disc format called Blu-ray. This ambition came with a catastrophic cost, both financially and reputationally. The PS3 was announced with a staggering price tag of $590 in the United States, a price that shocked and alienated the core audience that had made Sony successful. To make matters worse, the complex architecture made it incredibly hard for developers to create games, leading to a weak and delayed launch lineup. Meanwhile, their competitor, Microsoft, had learned from its mistakes. The Xbox 360, launched a full year earlier, was significantly cheaper and was much easier for developers to work with. It captured the market momentum completely. Sony's launch was a public relations nightmare. The PS3 was widely mocked as being too expensive, too complicated, and arrogant. The famous quote, "The next generation doesn't start until we say it does," came back to haunt them. For the first time, Sony was losing the console war, and losing badly. The company's gaming division was bleeding billions of dollars. It was their darkest hour. The comeback story of the PlayStation 3 is a lesson in humility, resilience, and long-term strategy. Swallowing their pride, Sony began a painful and expensive course correction. They streamlined the hardware, eventually lowering the price. They poured immense resources into their first-party studios, companies owned by Sony like Naughty Dog and Santa Monica Studio. These studios began to deliver a string of unparalleled exclusive masterpieces that simply could not be played anywhere else. Games like Uncharted 2, Among Thieves, The Last of Us, and God of War 3 were not just games. They were cinematic blockbusters that showcased the raw power of the PS3 and reminded the world why they had fallen in love with PlayStation in the first place. Furthermore, Sony's gamble on Blu-ray paid off. The PS3 became a Trojan horse that helped Blu-ray win the high-definition format war against HD DVD. Slowly, painstakingly, the PS3 began to climb out of its deep hole. By the end of its life cycle, it had nearly caught up to the Xbox 360 in sales, but the damage to Sony's reputation and finances was immense. The near failure of the PS3 was a brutal but necessary lesson. It taught Sony that they could not take their audience for granted. Power and technology were meaningless without great games and a fair price. They entered the next generation with a completely new mindset, a mindset of listening to their fans and putting gamers first. The launch of the PlayStation 4 was a masterclass in learning from past mistakes. In stark contrast to the arrogant PS3 reveal, Sony's 2013 announcement was humble, gamer-focused, and directly attacked Microsoft's missteps. They emphasized that the PS4 would be easy to develop for, would support used games without restrictions, and would be focused squarely on games, not on being an all-in-one entertainment hub. The price was a consumer-friendly $390, a full $100 less than the Xbox One. The message was clear: we are for the players. The audience responded overwhelmingly. The PS4 outsold the Xbox One by a ratio of nearly 2-to-1, reclaiming the throne that Sony had lost. It was a glorious return to form, built on a foundation of incredible exclusive games like Marvel's Spider-Man, Ghost of Tsushima, and The Last of Us Part 2. The story of PlayStation is a roller coaster of epic proportions. It is a story that began with a public humiliation, soared to unimaginable heights with the PS1 and PS2, crashed and burned with the PS3, and then achieved a phoenix-like resurrection with the PS4. It is the ultimate business drama, proving that in the fast-paced world of technology, no lead is safe, arrogance is the greatest enemy, and the only thing that truly matters is the love of the player.